The weekly Cybercrime and Business podcast is brought to you by Surfwatch Labs. Surfwatch Labs delivers cyber risk intelligence solutions that help organizations understand the potential for cyber attacks, determine the impact to their business, and proactively address threats head-on. Hey everyone out there, today is Friday, June 26, 2015. I am Jeff Peters, Surfwatch Labs editor, here with Matt Leifus, Surfwatch Labs writer, and Michael Fell, Surfwatch Labs data analyst. Coming up after our discussion on the latest news, we have an interview with Chris Strand. Chris is the Director of Compliance at Bit9 Carbon Black, and they just released their 2015 Point of Sale Security Mid-Year Health Assessment. So we talk about what's going on the point of sale front for various businesses. But yeah, I guess we'll jump right into it. And Matt, you can give us the top cyber headlines from Surfwatch Labs data this past week.
Sure. Coming in at number 3 this week, we have UC Irvine Health. The medical center notified just under 5,000 patients last week that one of their employees was accessing thousands of patient records over a 4-year period, and it wasn't job related, so he's just kind of going through, kind of scoping out patient data. The employee access files from June 2011 to March 2015, and the company found out about it. Information potentially compromised included patient health information, social security numbers, driver licenses, and it is unknown at this time if any fraudulent activity has taken place stemming from this employee's actions. Coming in at number 2, we have DTOP Tools. The Office of Personnel Management breach seems to have, kind of like a new revelation every week, it seems like, whether they're talking about how many people were affected. I think we're going to get into it a little bit later about a hearing on the Office of Personnel Management breach. Well, here's another thing we can talk about. According to Reuters, both the Anthem and Office of Personnel Management breaches are linked. And the key piece of evidence that's linking them was, and this is quoting Reuters, both the Anthem and OPM breaches use malicious software electronically signed as safe with a certificate from DTOP Tools. Both the Anthem and OPM breaches are already attributed to a Chinese state-sponsored hacker, but with this new link, it kind of ties the attack to a specific actor. So we'll kind of see in future news where we go with that. And the number 1 trending industry target for the week was LOT Polish Airlines. 1,400 passengers had their flights grounded at Warsaw's Chopin Airport this week after LOT Polish Airlines suffered a cyber attack. The attack took away the ability to issue flight plans, which are written accounts of the paths that pilots proposed to fly. Further investigations revealed that the airline was actually targeted with a DDoS attack, and the airline systems were down for about 5 hours. Those are the top trending industry targets for the week.
One of the things that stood out to me this week looking at our data was there was a lot of consumer goods targets. These were all related to the breach at point-of-sale vendor Missing Link Networks. I think it was earlier in the month when Missing Link issued a statement saying that eSeller Systems, their consumer direct sales platform, had been breached during the month of April 2015. And we talked about this on the podcast when that happened, but there wasn't a set number of people that were affected. But I saw just this last week, looking at our data and some articles, that there's at least 23 wineries, I believe all in California, that have been affected by this breach now. So it does seem like it's a pretty widespread breach. One thing that I should add is Surfwatch Labs is collecting data from the dark web now. I know Matt kind of came across this a little bit earlier. He was looking at the financial sector, and suddenly we had about 200 new banks in our system related to cybercrime because they had all their information being traded and sold on the underground market. So I thought that was just pretty interesting, just how many banks and stuff that we had managed to collect just in a couple of weeks' time.
Yeah, that's an interesting point about the dark web, is that if you just dig around a little bit, a lot of financial data, a lot of financial information's available for sale on the dark web. So Surfwatch Labs data is going to now reflect the wide gamut of data that you can find on the dark web. So that should be helpful for understanding situationally the market for this sort of data.
Yeah, I'm pretty excited for once we've been collecting it for a few months, and then we can kind of go through and see if things are trending or changing, or kind of how the data that's for sale on there is shifting over time. One of the interesting stories that you brought up, Matt, was this DDoS attack at Polish Airlines. People are talking about how it could be almost the first kind of attack of its kind. So I just thought that was pretty interesting. I don't know if that stood out to you as well.
Yeah, and when I was reading some of the articles on this, there were a few experts that were saying that they were actually relieved that it was just a DDoS attack, because that meant that hackers hadn't found some vulnerability in their systems and were able to exploit it. But either way you look at it, they were still victimized by a DDoS attack, and it still was successful in delaying flights. Couldn't that have some pretty dire circumstances down the line? I mean, what if you were able to take a network completely offline for a significant amount of time, even more than 5 hours? That would still have a pretty big impact, wouldn't it?
I do agree with your assessment, Matt, and that I think a lot of people were trying to find the silver lining to a certain extent. So the silver lining that they found was hey, at least a vulnerability wasn't exploited, and then they could manipulate the data, which would be bad. I think it would be extremely bad. But I think you're right, where the denial of service attack would hamper the operation of the airline. What I think I'd be more interested in is what are the motives of the attacker behind this attack on availability? What were they motivating? It could be a marketing ploy by a cyber criminal organization, or it could be a competitor. I'd be interested in finding out what's motivating the criminals, or if it was even a criminal organization. For all we know, it could be some sort of bug, and they're saying, hey, we got cyber attacked.
Yeah, at first it kind of reminded me of, I think it was a couple weeks ago when we were talking about Kaspersky Lab and how they found the Dooku 2.0, and they kind of spun it as good news, we found this vulnerability, and it kind of shifted we were breached, but they kind of spun it as hey, we found this vulnerability, so now we know about it. That's kind of what it reminded me of, yeah.
Yeah, I think it's interesting, just kind of looking back at some of the hacktivist activity, there was the bomb threat against the Sony CEO that was last year. So you just wonder if a hacktivist group or something decided to do distributed denial of service attacks against some other airlines or whatever, they could really disrupt quite a bit. I mean, just with this one attack, it affected 22 different flights. But in reading about this, one of the interesting things that came up was satellite communication vulnerabilities. I saw an article featuring IOActive's principal security consultant, Ruben Santamarta, and he was just explaining how he's done some research into satellite communication vulnerabilities, which includes things, aviation, the military, emergency services. And he was saying how they're often vulnerable to exploits and flaws, including backdoors, hard-coded credentials, insecure protocols, and weak encryption algorithms. So he was talking about this before it came out that this attack was simply a denial of service attack, but I think it does kind of highlight that the article was basically kind of trying to paint the picture that airlines could see increased attacks of this type. I spent most of my day, there was a hearing about the breach at the Office of Personnel Management. It was probably about 3 hours, and I had that on in the background all day as I was working. There's some funny moments. John McCain, he was getting pretty worked up. He kept asking the director, Kathleen Archuleta, he really wanted her to admit that it was definitely 100% the Chinese, and she wouldn't do that. I was just kind of chuckling about that. There's just been a lot of different numbers thrown around in the media about how many people were affected. And Archuleta, she said that the first 4.2 million number that we've heard about, they've all been notified of the breach, but no breach notifications have been sent pertaining to the background information, the SF-86 questionnaires. And that's really the important thing that a lot of people are talking about, because that contains private information on multiple family members, associates for each government official. It's not clear what else might have been stolen, but if interviews and other kind of source documents are stolen as well, there could be even more valuable information in there. But none of those people have been notified, and a lot of the people in Congress were really kind of hammering home and trying to get her to admit to a number, but she wouldn't say an official number yet, because she wants to wait until they get clear information on exactly what that number is. Well, one number that we've seen a lot of is this 18 million. She said that number is just the number of Social Security numbers that was in one system. So based off that, it sounds like the final tally is going to be more than 18 million people that were affected. But like she said, they probably won't know that for another week or so. I don't know if any of you guys have been following this OPM breach or anything interesting stood out to you about it this week.
Yeah, today I wrote the Cyber Weekend Review, and I actually saw a reference to the number 30 million potentially affected. And I know right now no one's going to say, for sure this is the amount, but it just kind of really throws out there the uncertainty behind how many people were affected. As a lot of people know, the initial number was 4 million past and current employees were impacted by the breach, and that number has gone up astronomically as time has gone by. And again, we just keep hearing so many more things about the Office of Personnel breach, and we'll probably, on Monday find out something new. I mean, that's kind of been the pattern for this event.
And Matt, to add on to what you just said, to give it a little context, yesterday Archuleta appeared in front of the House Government Affairs Committee, and the chairman, Congressman Chavitz, asked about specifically how many current and former federal employees were affected by the breach, and she said she couldn't say definitely. He was the one who threw out the 30 million number as a possibility, just to add some context to what you just said.
Yeah, and one other piece of news just relating to that, in case you guys listening haven't heard, is the initial breach has been tied to a federal contractor, Keypoint Government Solutions. Archuleta said that a hacker gained access to the network using stolen credentials from that federal contractor. So that's a pretty typical story we've seen in various situations, even, back to the Target breach, a contractor gets their credentials stolen and gets into the network and kind of ends up causing all these problems. That was sort of the big news this week. Is there anything else that stood out to you guys that you guys wanted to chat about?
Yeah, earlier we were talking about the dark web and how we're going to start incorporating that data. I went to write an article, and Jeff knows all about this, and I went into our data, and the article I was writing, and I'll get to that in a second, guys, it had to do with a new financial report that was released by Raytheon and WebSense called the 2015 Drill Down Report. This report actually said that, or found, I should say, that the financial sector is actually targeted 3 times more than any other sector out there by cyber criminals. But when I was writing this article, I went on our data and I found all of these added targets, and I was like, whoa, what's going on? But once we kind of took out all the dark web stuff, we actually found that the month of June is trending in the financial sector. There are 3 effect tags that really stood out. We had the personal information stolen leaked tag, data stolen leaked, and fraud. All are trending pretty high this month.
All right, moving on to the cyber tip of the week. One of the bigger stories earlier this year was the Superfish malware from Lenovo that everyone was talking about, which basically was kind of like bloatware that was making people less secure, making their computers less secure. We have a similar story that everyone's been talking about this week. Patrick Barker, he's a Microsoft MVP. He discovered that Samsung is disabling Windows updates on certain computers that they sell. He wrote, Samsung's SW update software is preventing Windows Update from automatically installing updates, and it forces the user to have it set to let me choose whether to download and install. And even if these users attempt to change it so that they can get their automatic security updates installed, this Samsung software will actually switch it right back when you reboot the computer. So essentially, it's disabling Windows Update from working as the user intends it to. So obviously, that's not a good thing. If you're putting out some kind of software as a company, you want to make sure you're not messing with some of the overall security stuff like we've seen with Superfish and now the Samsung. Because obviously, you're going to get into some hot water once different security researchers discover it. Now, moving on, we have our interview with Chris Strand, the Director of Compliance at Bit9 Carbon Black, and we chat about their 2015 Point of Sale Security Mid-Year Health Assessment.
So basically, we conducted a Bit9 Carbon Black survey, security health assessment of POS vendors across a few different verticals. It was 150 different security leaders of businesses and they all had over 250 million annual revenues. And of course, used POS devices. And some interesting findings, and just to give you a summary of some of those areas that we found compelling and that we almost expected to hear in terms of the health of the POS market. Of course, we've been doing work with the POS vendors, the POS market, the retail industry, et cetera, for quite some time now. And a lot of these results were of no surprise. But, I mean, they still raise an eyebrow when you see them. The first biggest thing we found was 63% of these companies are increasing POS security spending. But unfortunately, it doesn't appear that the money is being well spent. Now, this is just, again, this is our opinion based on the other statistics that came out of this. Some of the facts pointed to that only 38% of these organizations were able to detect malware on their POS systems in the last 2 years. And the last 2 years, of course, being extremely busy years for POS breaches. A lot of very similar breaches. Again, we see the revolving record happening over and over again of existing types of variants of malware hitting these POS systems. And it wasn't a huge surprise with what we've seen and the number of breaches we've seen against POS systems. But again, the spending is going up, but then where's the spending actually going? Is it really being put into technologies that will help with only 38% able to actually detect malware? And even more alarming was that more than 50% of these POS systems are still running Windows XP. Of course, it's well past a year now that it's been unsupported, and that leaves tremendous gaps in the system, and it's a bit of an alarming number when we consider it. Now, there's various reasons why that's happening, but again, it is what it is. We also found that 1 in 4 organizations, or 25%, still choose to invest or reinvest in AV technologies, antivirus technologies, and negative signature technologies that are very, very dated, of course, as we know, and are fairly ineffective at stopping the particular threats that are hitting these POS systems. And also, on top of that, 94% of these organizations are still running some form of AV. Now, that's not necessarily a bad thing because they might have it to take care of the nuisance malware, the stuff that we know about, et cetera. But it's not addressing the current threat, of course, and it's a very large number that are still actually relying and running on AV, and maybe that's their only source of security threat prevention. Then 24% of them feel that AV is inadequate. So the numbers are starting to counteract between one another because many of them, of course, feel that their AV technologies are not doing what they want the technology to do for them. So there is a market trend, and I mean, it's a good sign, actually, that the market trend is changing towards a paradigm shift where it appears that, POS merchants feel that, hey, we need to do something different. We feel that this is inadequate. I would like to see that 24% be a much larger number, but it is what it is again. And then only 39% of them were using any form of breach detection software. So, and that points to the ability that really they're still not in a continuous monitoring state. And as many of us know and we've seen in the press, et cetera, a lot of these organizations are affected by regulatory guidelines and whatnot that are asking them to be in a proactive or a continuous compliant state so that they know that the security controls are indeed working and they are pointing away from things like negative signature, antivirus, and other types of threat technologies. So really, again, this points to the fact that a large percentage of POS vendors, POS merchants and systems don't really have the ability to respond quickly. So if something does happen, they're not able to really get into it and basically respond to the incident in real time and figure out the who, what, when, where, and how immediately, rather than investing weeks on end to try to figure out exactly what happened.
One of the interesting numbers you brought up a couple of times was that 38% of organizations have detected malware on their systems. Now, I get from what you're saying that you think that number should be higher. Is it that there's more out there and people aren't detecting it, or is it possible that 38% is the real number?
I really feel that, yes, I do believe that it should be higher. I would like to see it higher. That's basically what I'm saying. I'm an optimist, I'm a pessimistic optimist, I suppose. And I want to see that number higher because, with the rate that the threat is changing right now and hitting these particular, especially with POS market, I mean, we see it every year, year over year. And I've watched this happen for the last 10 years now. And it's the same story over and over again. These threats get stronger and stronger, that we're not taking the steps to adequately protect. I mean, with only 38% able to detect malware, I mean, that's just the beginning. Detecting malware is the first piece, but you got to be able to prevent it. So it's a small number in terms of who can even take the first step to protect themselves. And then you work in the fact that there are all these unsupported systems. I mean, this is one of the assessment findings that came out of this, or that we developed out of this particular health report. And that's maybe the number is a bit smaller right now because these POS vendors are also facing other challenges, like the 50% that are still running Windows XP. And now a lot of them have many other common, hugely implemented operating systems that are going into an unsupported state. So they have to deal with that as well. So I think that's compounding the problem. Because if that's a very large problem for a lot of POS organizations, and I'm sure that is playing into the inability to actually detect and protect themselves against malware.
Yeah, I'm curious if you think the switch to chip and pin is playing into this at all as well. This year is supposed to be in October when that shift happens. I think it's October this year. So just wondering if your kind of thoughts on that in general, if that's sort of playing into maybe some of the problems that they're facing, or if you think that chip and pin in general is going to have a dramatic shift at all in terms of cybercrime?
Well, I would preface that with if we hit the chip and pin deadline, because the numbers that we're seeing of adoption rates are quite low. I mean, they're, I've done research across the industry on that, and we see it. Again, we see that in the press with how we're going to actually hit that deadline is not looking so great. But anyway, aside from that, chip and pin, of course, implementing encryption technologies and whatnot, and putting double locks on the door absolutely will help. I mean, it's a great step to take, but it's only protecting one portion of that POS transaction or that POS infrastructure. I mean, that is the point of inception, and that's what they're trying. And EMV chip and pin will really stop the theft at the inception point, and not all the time, because the idea of chip and pin has been compromised as well, the technology of chip and pin has been compromised also. So there are ways around it. It's more difficult, mind you, but again, I believe that it's a positive step in the right direction, but it's only a portion of that POS infrastructure. There's also the back-end payment systems. There's the transaction systems. If you look at any POS system, of course, it's the transmission, it's the processing, and it's the storage of that sensitive data. And that can be stolen at any level within that transaction chain. And the EMV chip and pin is addressing just one particular level of that, and that's the front end of the system. So do I think it's going to be a positive outcome if we do get to the deadline and we do manage by October of this year to implement EMV chip and pin? Absolutely. I think it's a great move forward, and it was a great recommendation in the community and the industry. But is it going to solve the problem? No, probably not, because if you have a vulnerability on one of those XP systems that you're still running that's unsupported, I'm going to get in and own your system at some point in time, and I won't even care that it's via the chip and pin. Because once that chip and pin is opened up, once you put that PIN number in, that releases the information on the card, and then it goes into the system. And at some point, it's going to be used. And regardless of the amount of maybe P2P or point-to-point encryption that you're using and such, it's got to be translated at some point in time or decrypted at some point in time and used. And that's where the potential for compromise will happen.
You said that most of the stuff that you guys found in the report was kind of what you expected. Was there anything that stood out to you as maybe something you weren't quite expecting to see that popped up?
I think the one thing that it's not that we didn't expect to see it, but the reliance on AV technologies, negative signature technologies, was, again, not surprising, but we didn't like to see that number was so high. The fact that 94% of organizations are still running AV. Now, that could be a cultural thing. I know it's built into the industry. A lot of regulations call for it, and they specifically call for things like AV. So that introduces some confusion in the industry, and also a reliance on, I want to do the right thing, so I'm just going to keep running this stuff. But the fact that they're still relying on it, and with the low detection rates that came out of the health report, as well as the low amount of organizations that are using, say, breach detection malware. The low percentage of organizations that actually have visibility or control over their infrastructure was pretty alarming. And again, there could be many reasons. But again, that was one of the percentages that we saw, and we thought, wow, we got to get moving or the POS industry has to get moving because, this is too heavy a reliance on one particular type of technology that's been proven not to stop the threat, essentially, not to solve the problem. So, that percentage was a bit alarming for us.
Then my last question is just wondering if there's maybe one best practice or several best practices that sort of stand out in your mind. I mean, you talked a little bit about having visibility and moving beyond AV technology, but if you're looking to give some advice to a business, I guess what would be the first couple things that you'd say?
Well, I would. There's a few recommendations that, of course, when we're working with many of these organizations that we look at and we go through a sort of a checklist of things. And increasing the amount of point-to-point encryption is always good because if you can make that data useless, that's the best thing that you can do. I mean, obviously, it's the attacker is going to take the path of least resistance. Now, it may be like putting another lock on the door, but that's a good start. But then on top of that, adapting some form of application or endpoint control, and I said visibility and control. These are two things that many organizations that are running POS systems simply don't have. And I mean, that really came out of our health report. Some kind of, be it, back in the day, people called it application whitelisting. Basically, only approved applications are allowed to run on that POS device. And that makes it impossible for malware to execute, even if it's introduced into the environment. So nowadays, it's more referred to as application control or endpoint control, but having the ability to, number one, just say if it's not part of what that POS system should be doing, if it doesn't belong there, it's not going to execute anyway. And then, that eliminates the analysis that you would have to do to try to figure out, hey, is this thing bad, or scanning that you would have to do on your system and such. It greatly reduces the administrative burden for a lot of these POS organizations to be able to just eliminate a huge percentage of the threat immediately. And then on top of that, building up their perimeter to a certain degree, but making use of that perimeter, right? I mean, better next-gen firewalls and whatnot around that perimeter to analyze things a little bit more. Well, that's great, but make sure you can make use of that network intelligence via maybe integrations with your endpoint. So it's kind of joining the network and the endpoint together is a common best practice that we recommend. And it's more so to, we collect a lot of information at the network layer, but because the breach doesn't happen there, it happens on your endpoint. So you need to be able to join those two together and make use of the threat intelligence that you're collecting at the network layer. And then, last but not least, breach detection systems. And that's not to be confused with things like, intrusion protection or intrusion detection systems and whatnot, because those types of systems still rely on signatures, right? So a list of things that they know are illicit or that are illicit activity. And that's not the way to go, because the problem is we can't keep up with that list. So breach detection systems in the way of actually recording what's going on, giving you the ability to have that visibility. So, control and visibility, have that visibility across your systems so that you have a recorded history of what actually happened so that you can walk back through the process chain when you do see something that looks compelling. Because even if you eliminate that 89% of malware that could harm you, there's also the zero-day threats and whatnot that would work from the insider threat, let's say, from the inside of your organization, or somebody who has taken command and control of one of your systems. So we have to be able to respond to that. We have to have better detection capabilities to be able to see if something looks a little odd, and to raise that red flag and send alerts around the organization against a smaller subset of data. And of course, that's key. So those would be the main recommendations. Again, these are the main recommendations that we're giving to our clients and customers that we're working with in the POS industry.
All right. Well, thanks for taking the time, Chris. We appreciate it.
Absolutely, Jeff. It was my pleasure, and I'd be happy to get on at any other time and help out.
Thanks for listening to this week's Cybercrime and Business podcast. As always, you can find us on iTunes, YouTube, and all the major podcasting sites. And for more information, check out surfwatchlabs.com.